Have you ever felt completely absorbed in an activity where everything flows effortlessly and time seems to disappear? That's what psychologists call flow state, a sense of being fully present and alive in the moment. Now imagine tapping into that same state to transform your intimacy and connection with your partner. In today's episode, we'll uncover the fascinating science of flow state and how it holds the key to unlocking deeper passion and pleasure in your relationships. Welcome to Pleasure in the Pause, a podcast dedicated to inspiring midlife women to feel more connected to their bodies, pleasure, and power through perimenopause, menopause, and beyond. I am your host, Gabriella Espinosa, women's health and sexual wellness coach, and it is my pleasure to be here with you. Today, I'm thrilled to welcome Dr. Emily Jamea, a leading sex and relationship therapist, speaker, and the best-selling author of Anatomy of Desire: 5 Secrets to Create Connection and Cultivate Passion. Dr. Jamea's work is grounded in over 15 years of clinical experience and her pioneering research on the intersection of intimacy and flow state theory. Her insights into how couples can reignite passion and deepen their connection have been featured in Oprah Magazine, CNN, USA Today, NBC, and more. As the host of the popular Love and Libido podcast and a sought-after speaker, Dr. Jamea brings a wealth of knowledge and warmth to her mission to make thriving, satisfying relationships accessible to everyone. In this episode, we'll dive into her new book and discuss the 5 secrets that can take your relationships and your connection with yourself to the next level. We'll also unpack why sexual satisfaction is so crucial to overall relationship happiness, and what the science of flow state can teach us about cultivating deeply satisfying intimacy. Whether you're navigating challenges in your relationship, looking to reignite passion in a long-term partnership, or simply curious about the deeper layers of desire, this conversation will inspire and empower you to explore the untapped potential of your intimate life. Let's welcome Dr. Emily Jamea. Welcome, Dr. Jamea.
Thank you so much for having me today. I'm thrilled to be here with you.
I'm so excited to dive into this conversation with you. I'd love to start by asking you to take us back to the beginning, before you became a sex and relationship therapist, and share with us some of the narratives around pleasure and sexuality that you grew up with. Were you always this comfortable talking about sex?
I have to say, I think I'm one of the lucky ones in that I grew up in a pretty small conservative town in Southeast Tennessee, but my father was an OBGYN. In our household, conversations about sex and sexuality were no big deal. I heard him on the phone with his patients all the time talking about everything under the sun. And so it's something I think from a pretty young age I was comfortable with. It became apparent to me probably beginning in like middle school that a lot of my friends weren't. They had questions, or maybe they wanted to get on birth control and they were too scared to go to their parents. That was maybe a little bit later in high school. So they would come to me and we would have these conversations about it, or they'd be like, hey, do you think your dad can help me out with this? And so I became like a go-between, I think, and probably started giving sex advice long before I was certified to do so. I think it was sort of a natural calling from me from a very young age.
I love that. You are the friend we all need to grow up with. And I actually had one of those friends in high school, one of my best friends whose father was an OBGYN, and she was sort of the first friend who introduced me to these conversations. So I have had one of those friends, and oh my gosh, I am indebted to her for.
Yeah, I have to say, growing up, I can't say there was much dialogue around things like pleasure specifically. Given the time at which I grew up, I feel like the material that I got was a lot more than the average friend that I had, for sure.
Excellent. I've had quite a few sexual medicine and sexual health experts here on the show, but you are the first sex therapist to join us.
Wow, awesome. I am happy to bring that on.
So for our audience, can you explain, please, what a sex therapist does, what drew you to this field, and how has that passion evolved into helping couples navigate desire and connection?
Yeah, so A sex therapist is just a therapist who specializes or focuses on issues related to sexuality, just like other therapists may focus on things like eating disorders or addiction or trauma or play therapy. Our focus is on sexuality. Therapists can become certified sex therapists kind of from all walks of life. I would say probably the majority have at least some training already in marriage and family therapy or in couples therapy, but not all. And it's interesting, a lot of the marriage and family therapy programs don't require any training at all on sexuality. That's starting to change a little bit, but there are tons of licensed marriage therapists out there with no training on how to talk to their clients about sex. And for me, it was something I specialized in pretty early when I was an undergrad at UT, which I understand is your alma mater, hook 'em horns. I was studying psychology and took a human sexuality elective. And I was just hooked from that point on. I was like, wow, finding out about someone's sexuality is such an interesting window into the psyche. I think that you can learn so much about a person's psychology by finding out about their understanding and expression of sex. And so I think by the time I graduated UT, I had taken every sexuality course offered. And then same with my graduate program, just as much as I could, I focused every paper somehow tied back to sexuality. So it's something I focused on for a very long time. And then I think the third part of your question was how I help couples navigate issues like desire and pleasure. People come to sex therapy for all kinds of reasons. For sure, desire is the most common, yet most complex issues that sex therapists treat. But I also treat issues with orgasm or sexual pain or erectile dysfunction, premature ejaculation. I treat issues with the, LGBTQI community and kind of everything in between. But desire is a big one for sure, and I think is probably a large reason why I ended up writing a book about it.
Yes, let's dive into it. Your book, which I have here, beautiful cover,
Thank
Anatomy
you.
of Desire, 5 Secrets to Create Connection and Cultivate Passion. I love how you break down the latest science in an accessible and meaningful way while also incorporating real and relatable case studies from couples. I
Mhm.
love hearing about the couples because I listened to your book also on audio, and
Mhm.
great how you played out those scenarios between the different couples. Can you share the inspiration behind writing Anatomy of Desire and why you felt now was the perfect time to introduce your 5 secrets for creating connection and cultivating passion to the world?
The publishing process is a long one, and so at the time that I began formulating this idea, it was probably close to 10 years ago, maybe between 7 to 10 years ago. 7 years ago is when I started the research that set the foundation for the book. And what initiated that research study is that I noticed over time I could help couples, for the most part, overcome the issues that they brought into the therapy office. And what I always do is schedule kind of a follow up or accountability session a few months down from the time that we wrap up our therapy together. And a lot of couples came in very appreciative and happy with the work that they had done. But many of them were just longing for a little more intensity, a little more excitement, a little more passion. And they would talk about how they want it to felt like it did in the honeymoon stage, or they would talk about wanting sex like it seems to be in Hollywood. And, I'd give them my spiel about how the honeymoon stage is a very temporary, yes, intoxicating neurochemical high, but it's not sustainable over time. And that in Hollywood, it's paid actors with multiple takes that go into creating those scenes. That's not realistic either. And I'd cite like the good enough sex research, which is literally the phrase that's used is good enough sex. And I could see them deflate. And one thing else that was going on that I don't really write about in the book is that at that time I was newly engaged. And I was like, I'll be damned if I'm going to have good enough sex for the long haul. Like, I got to figure out what's the secret sauce. So I started asking really pointed questions to them about what exactly it was they wanted to feel when they were like, how would they know that they were having this really great sex? And they would use words like, the world around me disappears. I want to feel lost in the moment. And it occurred to me that they were using language that we use to describe a flow state. So, for people listening who don't know what a flow state is, it's a term that was coined decades ago by this psychologist named Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. And it's the state of mind we get into when we are engaged in an activity in which we experience that loss of space and time, almost transcendence, total absorption. Think of a surfer who's at one with the wave. Of course, that's what people want to feel during sex. Being a very evidence based practitioner, I turned to the literature to see what I could find, and there was nothing out there. I found one paper that looked at a very small sample size of couples who practice BDSM, but there was no large scale study and really nothing that looked at flow as it relates to great sex with the questions that I had in mind. So I initiated my own research study and went on to publish my findings. And then what I did is I called up the participants who got the highest scores on the measure and had really long conversations with them about what it was like for them when they were having sex that put them into a flow state and what specifically they did to get there. And it was through those conversations that these 5 secrets emerged. And so in the book, I outline the 5 secrets and then weave the science of flow into each one.
And I love that you have brought this concept of flow state, which I didn't know was a scientific concept. If you navigate in mindfulness or tantric spirituality circles, we talk a lot about that. And so I've dabbled in those circles and I love it because of the conversations around those flow states. It can sound very woo or out there. And what I've tried to do here on the podcast is bring some of those more esoteric concepts and make them accessible. So when I found out that you came out with this book and we're making this very esoteric concept so accessible, I was like, hooray, finally.
Yes.
And yeah, you discovered it, as you said, 10 years ago. It's been around for ages.
This has been around for millennia. Yeah. And exactly to your point, these themes are themes that emerge when you study Tantra or some, kind of Eastern philosophies as it relates to transcendence and sexuality. But that's not palatable for the average American. And it can feel kind of woo-woo, hard to understand, difficult to apply. But I think at the end, it's all flow state. And the thing is, most people can think of something that puts them into a state of flow, but it's most widely studied in the arts or in athletics. And surgeons get into a state of flow when they're operating, pilots when they're flying, your friend who's addicted to the runner's high. Most of us have something. And we know from flow science that flow state is something humans are hardwired to experience. It's not like this is going to be a barrier to anybody. But for some reason, it just hadn't really been studied as it relates to sex. Csikszentmihalyi wrote a little bit about it in his book Flow. There was like a paragraph dedicated to it, but that was pretty much it. And in my mind, I'm like, okay, if sex is something that most adults are having, it would be great if I could teach them how to experience this kind of transcendence, something they're already doing, because maybe not everyone is going to pick up oil painting or surfing or downhill mountain bike racing. Sex is something I think that most of us can pick up from time to time.
Thank you so much for doing that work. You start with embodiment, which I love as an embodiment coach myself. It's definitely a concept that really brought me into this work that I do as a podcast host of Pleasure in the Pause and as a coach. So you start with embodiment as a key entry point to unlocking your first secret. And I love the way you focus on an embodiment and how you weave it into your book and into your clinical practice. For those who might not be familiar with the term, again, this is another term that gets overused in the wellness world, sometimes depicted by beautiful women and flow fabrics.
So true.
Very inaccessible. So For those who may not be familiar with the term embodiment, can you define what embodiment means and share some simple ways that we can begin to access this way of being in our bodies and moving through the world?
Yeah, Mark Walsh, I'm sure you're familiar with his work as an embodiment coach. I love the way he defines embodiment, which is rather than being aware of the body, we have to be aware as the body.
Mhm.
And that minor change in preposition, I think, is so profound. So, mindfulness, I think, is a good first step. Mindfulness essentially is when you notice an intrusive thought or something that's trying to pull your attention away from the body. Hopefully are non-reactive about it, and then you intentionally bring your awareness back into the body. People who are fully embodied don't really have to go through that whole process because the mind quiets down and it's almost as if the body has a mind of its own. And really, flow state is one of the best ways to experience that. When we're in a state of flow, we experience this phenomenon referred to as transient hypofrontality. What
Mhm.
that means is that the prefrontal cortex part of our brain quiets down. And it's the prefrontal cortex that houses our higher order thinking, the chitter chatter, the never ending to do list that so many women complain about getting in the way of embodiment. And so when that part of the brain quiets, the ego goes away and we become less self aware and less self conscious and more present in our bodies. And if anyone is listening to this thinking that they can't get into that state, what I like to remind people, and this is actually true of all five secrets, is that we're born this way. Anyone with kids can observe how they explore and understand the world through their bodies and through the five senses. And so this really is not a matter of becoming someone you're not or being super woo woo. It's a matter of reconnecting with this quality that is very much alive within us. We just have to learn how to access it.
So it's literally getting out of our heads and into our bodies,
Yes,
acce-
precisely.
accessing that intelligence and beauty that is already there. It's already within us. What would you say are some of the barriers to embodiment? I know there's so many in this busy, driven world, but we're so disconnected from that innate intelligence.
Yes, I think the biggest barrier to embodiment is the busy lives we lead and multitasking. What I tell people is that you cannot expect to go from split attention all day long, as many of us do. How many of us are checking emails over lunch or listening to a podcast while driving or having a phone call while we're jogging on the treadmill? We're just constantly splitting our attention between two things and going at 60 miles an hour. And so you just can't expect to go from that pace to this singular focus of sex with the snap of a finger. That's part of the problem is when it comes to focus and attention. So focus drives flow. That's something I want everyone to remember. Focus drives flow. When it comes to focus, we know from other research that I think it takes an average of 11 minutes to get into a focused state. If that focus is broken for some reason, it can take another 25 minutes to get refocused. Most people don't have sex for even 11 minutes. So, what this means is that we have to do a little bit of planning and think about maybe on a day that we're wanting to have really great embodied sex, setting up our day so that we can get more in touch with our bodies and be present throughout the day. Just slow down a little bit when it comes to the sexual act itself and not rush through it so much. I write about this in the book. We've just gotten to the point where we're rushing through everything. And who wants to rush through something if it's really good? And something's probably not going to be good if we're rushing through it. So we've got to learn to slow down a little bit. Flow happens in a series of stages. There's actually 4 stages. And the first one is the struggle phase, meaning that you may be flooded with a little bit of cortisol or concern that you're not going to get into a flow state. And when it comes to sex, that's usually where people throw the towel in. But we've got to be patient enough to move through the struggle phase into the release phase, which is when we start to relax a little bit. And then eventually the third stage is flow.
Mhm. So embodiment is that first step to unlocking the first secret that you write about in the book, sensuality. Can you give us a few ways how we can cultivate sensuality in our daily lives?
Sure. Before I do, though, I want to say these are not laid out in like a stepwise process, meaning you don't have to master sensuality before moving on to the rest. I like to tell people that this is more of a menu than a roadmap. So just depending on what you need, you can open up a chapter and probably find something. And you don't have to have all 5 at once to get into a state of flow. So that takes a little bit of pressure off. But to answer your question, I'll say this. Another study I did looked at people who were sensual in their day-to-day lives and how that affected their sexual satisfaction, and found that yes, people who were more likely to stop and smell the roses, feel the warmth of the shower in the morning, tended to have higher satisfaction. So I think the more we can do to single task, to be present in our bodies, in our day-to-day life. So this does not start from the time we get into bed. This is sort of a shift in our everyday living. That can go a long way. A lot of people think that having a glass of wine will help them relax and unwind and maybe lower inhibitions a little bit to get in the mood for sex. I'm not like a teetotaler by any means. We know that alcohol is a sexual response inhibitor and can disconnect us from the body. What we can do a lot more quickly is take literally 30 seconds. Okay. This does not have to be some long drawn out process, just to take a few really deep diaphragmatic breaths before getting into bed with our partner. Or like I was just talking to Mark Walsh on my podcast, he says he'll have people like lean back to back against each other. That can create that sense of grounded connection that sets the stage for embodiment. So little things like that. We're not talking about any big tantric experience necessarily. There's a lot of little things we can do throughout the day to help prime that pathway.
Yeah, and absolutely. It starts outside the bedroom.
Right.
And even before you come into connection with a partner, it's something that you can do on your own. And I think that you talked about earlier, that resistance that we have to doing that, right? I sometimes feel with a lot of the women that I work with that we override that urge or that impulse to turn towards those simple everyday pleasures because I don't have enough time. It's too selfish, too indulgent. It's these narratives, these scripts that we have in our minds around what it means to be a female accessing pleasure. What is your advice in starting with those beliefs, that mindset? How do we adopt a pleasure sensual mindset?
For women in particular, I encourage self-pleasure to start. You know, you cannot expect to get into a flow state with your partner if you can't surrender to a pleasurable experience by yourself. And so practicing embodied self-pleasure is something I write about in that chapter. Men are more likely to self-pleasure and masturbate than women are, and do so with a bit greater frequency. Women do, but with a little bit less disinhibition, I would say, about their bodies. They're maybe more likely to just grab the vibrator and not even touch themselves at all in the process. And hey, I'm not anti-vibrator by any means, but I think it's kind of like just looking for these shortcuts rather than discovering what the body is capable of without the use of any outside equipment. Now, I know this is pleasure in the pause, and we've got a lot of women who are menopausal, postmenopausal. And I will say that orgasms do become a bit more elusive as we age, and vibrators can come in really handy. But at least I would say spend some time exploring your body with your own 2 hands, or even experimenting with sensation a little bit. Notice the feel of a feather on the belly, or an ice cube or something like that, just to draw your attention in. Little things like that can help really drive that focus. And if you remember, focus drives flow. So that can help a lot.
Yes. And to your point about being in perimenopause and menopause and how our arousal and orgasmic states change, I do feel this focus on embodiment and sensuality as a starting point can help open up new pathways to pleasure because our bodies are changing. What gave us pleasure when we were 20, 30, 40 is not going to be the same. And I know for me, it has been an incredible doorway to discovering new pleasure pathways and understanding that it's ever evolving. And it's so exciting when you discover something new about your body or about your sensuality or pleasure that you never thought was there or was even possible.
Totally. And what you're describing is what the adaptability chapter is all about. The adaptability chapter is about discovering new pleasure pathways and understanding that the way you had sex maybe in the early days of your relationship is going to look different 5, 10, 15 years down the line when you maybe can't rely on erections as well as you could before, or your hip is a little arthritic and you can't rely on the same positions you used to. There's just so many variables that come into play that threaten to throw a wrench in our sexual connection. But the people in my study who I talked to who maintained like really great flow state sex found ways of navigating those. They had these really broad definitions of what sex was. Sex for them did not begin with the male erection and end with the male orgasm. I had one couple who described it as this kind of constant energetic flow in the relationships they dipped in and out of, depending on what was going on for them. And so adaptability is about thinking outside the box and having a growth mindset so that we can discover these really exciting new pleasure pathways because we understand there's always something new to discover.
Can you share with us one tip or strategy that couples can undertake to become more adaptable in their intimate lives?
I love falling back on Susan David's work for this and a question. So she wrote the book Emotional Agility. And I cite her work in this chapter. And I think the best question is, but what else am I? Okay, so when we have something that is threatening maybe our sexual interaction or the way we see ourselves as a sexual being, we tend to focus on that one piece. And if we take a step back and instead of focusing on what isn't working, focusing on everything else that is working, we will often find that we have a lot of great things yet to work with. And so that's the one question that I just love asking people like, okay, yes, there's this thing, but what else is going on? What else do we still have to work with?
And that requires another secret to your formula, which is curiosity, right? I love talking curiosity. How does maintaining curiosity about our partners, especially in long-term relationships, contribute to these flow states or to sustained passion over time?
So, the flow component that I write about in this chapter is something called the challenge skills ratio. I should back up and say that flow state has 8 components. One of them is this phenomenon known as the challenge skills balance, and it's one of the greatest predictors of flow. And it's, for many reasons, one of my favorites. It's best illustrated with a visual, but since this is a podcast, imagine an XY axis. And on the Y axis, you have how challenging something is. And on the X axis, you have your skill set with that thing. Let's take tennis as an example. When the challenge of what you're doing is too far above your skill set, you'll feel anxious or scared. Okay. So challenge too high, anxiety. If the challenge of what you're doing is too far below your skill set, you'll feel bored and uninterested. And this is where people kind of get stuck. Either in long-term relationships, sex becomes monotonous and boring because there is no challenge or interest or sense of novelty. It's just a like Groundhog's Day when it comes to what they're doing sexually. Or they'll try to implement something new, but they step way too far outside their comfort zone. And then they flip themselves into that challenge too high anxiety quadrant. What people need to remember is that to get into a state of flow, the challenge of what we're doing only needs to be about 4% greater than our skill set. That is not much at all. And so sometimes it's more about finding something you're already comfortable and familiar with and seeing if you can make it more psychologically or emotionally interesting. I've applied this model a lot to my clients since writing the book, and I wish that this story would have made it into the book, but it was published by this point or in production. But I had a client who was pretty reliant on the missionary position, which there's a lot of wonderful things about missionary, but it was the same. He's supporting himself on his elbows, that belly to belly, breathing in her ear type of missionary. And I was talking to him about the challenge skills balance. And so the next time they had sex, he like took one hand and cupped the back of her head and then held her other hand down by her hip and talked about how much more romantic the whole thing felt with that really subtle 4% difference. And it was enough of kind of a sense of novelty to her that they had this really great sex just from that very subtle shift. So that's just one little example, but this is where I encourage couples to really talk through what baby steps they need to take to help get them there.
That's such a beautiful example. I really love that. And it's using something that's so simple, the power of touch that's so accessible to us. It's not about bringing the latest gadgets, toys,
Right.
tricks, which they're fun to introduce.
Yeah, totally. There's a place for that, but it's not just that.
Moving on to the other secrets, we don't have to go deep into them, but I'd love to touch on vulnerability because it often feels so daunting. How can partners create a safe space to be vulnerable with each other? And why do you feel this is so important in intimacy?
Yeah, I mean, that word safety is just key. In the study I did that looked at sensuality, curiosity outside the bedroom and how that related to satisfaction inside the bedroom, one of the other variables I assessed was attachment, their relationship attachment, and found that people who they could be the most sensual, curious, down to try anything kind of person in the world. If they were in an insecurely attached relationship, the sexual satisfaction scores plummeted. So relationship attachment moderated how strongly sensuality and curiosity affected sexual satisfaction, meaning that sense of emotional safety in a relationship is everything. It's a very foundational element. Yet a lot of people reduce sex down to like a juxtaposition of body parts and shut themselves off emotionally, or people who are more anxious will maybe over rely on sex to make them feel seen and validated in a relationship. And so I write about different attachment styles in the book, and people can read it and probably discern which attachment style they have and how each of those styles can help propel someone into flow state sex or maybe inhibiting them from getting into a flow state when it comes to sex. But by and large, I find that a lot of people kind of tune out their partner emotionally, and sex becomes more about getting off. And there's just so much more to it than that. What I remind people is if it's just about getting off, like you can take care of that yourself. Why turn toward your partner if you're not going to tap into the emotional element?
And do you find this is more applicable to women, that need for safety in our bodies and during intimacy?
No, I find it is important for both men and women, especially men. I just think that there's so much gender socialization here as it relates to vulnerability. I can't tell you how many men I have worked with over the years who come to therapy because they're experiencing issues with their erections when they're having casual sex, and they don't understand why that is. And I'm like, because there's no emotional connection, but you've been taught your whole life that you shouldn't need that. And now you're thinking there's something wrong with you. We know that a lot of times men will seek out sex workers, not just to have sex, but because they want to be cuddled and held. So, no, this kind of need for emotional safety, I think, is important for both. Men will experience sexual dysfunction very quickly if there is a lack of safety in the relationship.
Yeah, so important. And you touch on this on the book, and we've talked about this on the podcast, how key communication is for moving into that space of vulnerability. So, so important. What is your advice to broaching that topic? Where do we start when it comes to communication? What is your advice?
I tell people to open with the fact that, hey, I want to share something with you, but I'm really scared to do so. Lead with that. And then ask, do you feel like you can contribute to creating a safe place for me to share this thing? If the answer is no, then you have all you need to know right there that you're probably not going to have the best sex with this person. Hopefully, they will say yes. And then you can get whatever it is off your chest and hopefully have a more productive conversation and understand that the conversation in and of itself is intimacy deepening. And I also tell people, I'm always asked the questions like, how do I do X, Y, or Z without it feeling awkward? And I'm like, you don't. You are courageous enough to push through the awkwardness and trust that in doing so, again, intimacy will deepen a little bit. And so that's usually my advice for having those hard conversations.
Yeah. Embrace the awkwardness.
You got to do only one way. I had a therapist tell me once, the only way out is in.
And so the final secret is attunement. I think this is the most beautiful one, that deep presence and connection with another. And you said it earlier, it's sometimes so easy for some of us to just pop into our heads, move out of our bodies and into our mind space, go through the laundry list.
Right.
I forgot to do. What do you advise people in terms of really moving into that space of deep presence, not only in themselves, but with each other?
Practice. The attunement is not going to happen if sex is really infrequent. I use the example of a pair of ballroom dancers who've been dancing together for years, and she knows what the lift of her hand is signaling her body to do without thinking about it at all. This is all about nonverbal communication. And we are, again, hardwired to do this. We have these neurons in our brain called mirror neurons, which means that our bodies have the potential to feel what another person's body is experiencing almost intuitively. But again, for many reasons, we're not very in touch with that part of ourselves. And so this is where I think having quality time with our partner, really having like uninterrupted time where we're having a conversation without any distractions. There's such a focus, I think, on communication skills, and that's important. But attunement really is about learning to pay attention to all the nonverbal cues that are happening at any given time, and not just paying attention to them with your higher order cognition, but with your own body. Again, this like ties back to embodiment. Attunement, I would say, is the gestalt of the other four secrets where everything comes together.
And again, this is something that can happen outside of the bedroom. As a long-time yoga practitioner, I feel just being able to sit with yourself. It doesn't take much, 5 minutes, observing your thoughts, observing sensations, feelings, make that a practice can definitely strengthen that muscle of attunement. But again, we're so busy.
I mean, it's not going to happen if you're never carving out time present with each other.
Yeah, so important. I love that in your book, you talk about the importance of understanding our sexual values, the attitude, beliefs, and feelings about what's right for us sexually individually. How do you recommend couples go about determining their sexual value? Should it be done as an individual process, a joint conversation? And how do we navigate meeting each other where we are if our values differ?
Yeah, having values that align is, as I'm sure everyone can imagine, really important for a strong sexual connection. I usually recommend beginning that exploration individually and then having a conversation with your partner, because It may not be. And I think I even included this in there until we have conversations with people who maybe hold different values for us, that another door opens that we didn't even see was there before. So conversation with others is an important step in understanding our own personal values. So I think that piece is important too. But yes, I have a list of questions in the book that people can ask themselves to help jumpstart their own personal exploration and also the conversation with their partner.
Mm. And you also have in the appendix of your book, you include a fantastic exercise about exploring sexual likes and dislikes.
Mhm.
Excellent tool for breaking the ice, overcoming shyness, and really expressing our preferences and exploring that sense of curiosity, which you talk about in the book. I
Yeah.
find that for many women, they often find themselves stuck in old sexual scripts or are more in touch with what they don't like versus what they do. Many women tell me, I don't know what I like. I don't know what I desire. How do you recommend we move past this stuckness to rediscover, even uncover our true desires? Because I was looking through that list and I could see where if someone was so out of touch with the desires, it would be tricky. Do I like licking? What do you recommend? How do we get
So
unstuck?
you can't say for sure whether or not you like something until you try it. And sometimes not until you try it a couple of times. So this is where being open, a lot of people will maybe look at some of the things on that list and have a very automatic no reaction. But I think especially if you notice you have an automatic no reaction, spend some time exploring where that automatic no came from. Is it because of these internalized beliefs that you've never challenged before? Have you ever talked to someone who does that one specific sex act to understand like what it's like for them and why they like it? Nowadays, you can probably Google it and find all kinds of stuff and maybe educate yourself a little bit. I mean, a lot of times people will say no without even educating themselves about something, especially in the sexual domain. So what I tell people is to circle as many maybes as you can, but if there is a hard no, at least, at the very least, spend some time exploring where that no is coming from. And again, also understand that the first time you do something might not be super exciting. Let's say you want to take up snow skiing. My heart breaks when I see an adult on the mountain taking a ski instruction because it's hard and uncomfortable, until you kind of get your bearings, which takes a few days. We have to have the same mentality when it comes to trying new things in the bedroom.
Excellent, excellent advice. What I love about your book is that this is suitable for couples to read together. I work with mostly women, and so I
Mhm.
give women practices and exercises to do. But I love that this is geared towards couples. You have all your case studies involve real life couples and their struggles, which are so relatable and makes you think, oh, we're not the only one. So I
No.
recommend that you read this book with your partner. Whether it's a new partner, you can do the little practical exercises to determine your sexual values, the activities to determine your likes and dislikes. If you're in a new relationship, a long-term relationship, I think this is such a useful guide. So tell us, Dr. Jamia, I know that when people buy your book, they can unlock a whole treasure trove. Can you
Yes.
talk about that, please?
Thank you. Yes. So, you can buy the book everywhere books are sold in every format. And then if you go to my website, emilyjamea.com or even anatomyofdesire.com, it all links together. You can put your purchase info in there and get access to like $290 worth of free bonuses. And then there's upgrade options available too. So I have tons of online learning material. The workshop that corresponds with the book has all the exercises that didn't make the final cut are there. So just lots of things to try.
Wonderful, wonderful. Before we say goodbye, I would love to ask you a question that I ask all my guests. What does pleasure mean to you, Dr. Jamia?
Pleasure to me, I think, just means really deep enjoyment of something. It means taking a moment to enjoy something totally and deeply, fully, completely for what it is. So I think that's what pleasure means to me.
Yeah, that's that deep attunement that you talk about.
Yeah. Yeah.
Present. So beautiful.
Mhm.
And how can we access you, your work? Where can we find you?
Sure. So I mentioned my website, emilyjamea.com. I'm across all the social media platforms at Dr. Emily Jamea. And if you like podcasts, you can check out mine as well. It's called Love and Libido.
Oh, wonderful. Okay, we'll definitely do that. I'll put all of those links in the show notes.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your presence, for your time, for sharing your expertise with us today.
Absolutely. The pleasure is all mine.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of Pleasure in the Pause. Want to help me spread more pleasure in the world? Hit the share episode button and send it to a friend or post it on your Instagram stories and tag me, Gabriella Espinosa. And if you really love this podcast, please leave a rating or review, as this helps the show get in front of new listeners. Finally, if you would like to access even more pleasure and stay in touch, sign up for my free pleasure upgrade bundle of powerful mind-body practices by going to pleasureinthepause.com. Remember, your pleasure matters.